There are things towns keep hidden, not beneath the earth, but tucked away in drawers, in attics, in the back offices of courthouses where nobody ever bothers to look twice. A sealed letter is one such thing. It rests in silence. It bides its time, and sometimes it lingers long enough that the people who once feared its contents are gone, already beyond consequence, or so they assumed. In Harlow, Virginia, there exists a letter written in the autumn of 1845, sealed with black wax by a man who told no one what lay inside. His only instruction, recorded verbatim in the town council minutes, was that the letter remain unopened until every soul who had ever resided in Harlow during his lifetime had drawn their final breath. He warned that opening it before that day would yield nothing but sorrow. The town, being proud and pragmatic, laughed at him. It took 91 years. In 1936, when the last surviving resident from that era finally passed away, a woman of 94 who had been born the very year the letter was sealed, the town clerk discovered the envelope in a cedar box in the basement of the old municipal hall, exactly where the records indicated it had been stored. The wax remained unbroken. The ink on the exterior, in that particular man's handwriting, had scarcely faded. The letter was opened on a Thursday afternoon in March before 7 witnesses. By Friday evening, 2 of those witnesses had resigned from public office. By the following Monday, the town's most established families had ceased speaking to one another. And by the end of that summer, Harlow had lost something it would never fully reclaim. Not its structures, not its territory, but its narrative. The story it had always told itself. What was contained in that letter? That is precisely what we are going to uncover. And I assure you, by the time we finish, you will comprehend why the man who composed it chose to seal it rather than speak it. You will grasp why the town kept it hidden for 91 years. And you will find yourself asking, as many have, whether it would have been wiser for everyone if it had remained sealed forever. Before we proceed with the story of Harlow, Virginia, and the letter that unraveled it, be sure you are subscribed to Canal English Loft so you never miss a tale like this one, and leave a comment below. Tell us which state or city you are listening from. We want to know where in the world our audience is. Now let us return to the beginning, because to understand the letter, you must first understand the man who wrote it. His name was Edmund Farrow. He was born in 1798 in a modest farmhouse on the eastern edge of what would eventually become Harlow, in a stretch of Virginia Piedmont country where the soil ran red and the creeks stayed cold even in summer. His father Thomas Farrow was a tobacco farmer of middling means, not wealthy enough to be invited to the grand estates along the river, but not so poor as to be overlooked at market. He owned 12 acres, 2 horses, and a reputation for honesty that his neighbors valued and his competitors resented. His mother Clara was the daughter of a Welsh immigrant who had arrived in the 1760s and established himself in Virginia with the stubborn assurance of a man who believed the New World owed him a living. Edmund was the second of 4 children, and by all accounts that survive, he was the peculiar one. Not peculiar in any obvious way, not reckless, not aggressive, not prone to outbursts or visions. Peculiar in the subtler, more unsettling manner. He observed things. He observed things that others walked past without noticing, and he had a habit, which his mother tried and failed to break, of recording them. As a boy, he kept a small notebook in his coat pocket, and whenever something captured his attention, he would pause mid-step and write it down. An inconsistency in a neighbor's fence line, a horse that had changed hands without anyone announcing the transaction, a widow who suddenly had funds for repairs she had been unable to afford for years. Thomas Farrow died in 1819 when Edmund was 21, leaving him the farm and a modest debt. Edmund cleared that debt in 3 years, not by selling more tobacco, but by lending money at interest to his neighbors, carefully, with terms fair enough to be accepted and exact enough to be enforced. By 1825, he was the most dependable lender in the county. By 1830, he was on the town council, and by 1835, when Harlow was formally incorporated as a town, Edmund Farrow was the man who drafted the charter. He was never the mayor. He never sought the office. He seemed, in truth, to deliberately pursue positions that carried authority without visibility. Town clerk, then town treasurer, then chairman of a minor committee ostensibly responsible for maintaining public roads, but whose actual function, as anyone paying attention understood, was to manage the intricate web of debts, favors, and obligations that held Harlow together. He knew where every dollar in town had originated and where it had gone. He knew who owed whom and who had forgiven what. He knew, with the exact and unsentimental clarity of a man who had spent his entire life watching, which families had risen and which had quietly fallen, and which had simply managed to appear as though neither had happened. People found him useful. They found him useful in the way people find a particular tool useful, reaching for it when needed, setting it aside when not, and never quite pausing to consider what it feels like to be the tool. Edmund Farrow, as far as anyone could tell, did not seem to mind. He never married. He lived alone in the house he had inherited, kept it tidy and orderly, and appeared to require very little from the world beyond the capacity to observe it. There was one person in Harlow who seemed to genuinely know him. Her name was Ruth Patton, and she was the wife of a dry goods merchant named George Patton, a loud, generous, and somewhat careless man who was universally liked and perpetually in financial difficulty. Ruth was quieter than her husband and sharper. She and Edmund had grown up within a mile of each other, had attended the same church as children, and had maintained for 30 years a friendship that the town noted without fully comprehending. They were not romantic. Everyone agreed on that, or at least everyone said so. But they were close in a way that suggested they shared something neither had ever shared with anyone else. Ruth Patton died in October of 1843 from a fever that swept through Harlow that autumn, claiming 11 lives. She was 44 years old. Edmund Farrow was at her bedside when she passed. He did not attend the burial service. He returned home and for the first time in anyone's memory, he missed the weekly council meeting. He sent word that he was unwell. He remained absent for 3 weeks. When he returned, he looked the same as always. The same dark coat, the same watchful eyes, the same habit of arriving exactly on time and leaving precisely when business concluded. But something within him had shifted. Those who knew him well, and there were few, sensed that the thing that had kept him engaged with Harlow's daily affairs had been Ruth Patton, and that with her gone, his engagement had become something else, something more calculated, more conclusive. He spent the better part of the next 2 years, 1844 and 1845, engaged in quiet, methodical activity that no one understood at the time. He began reviewing old records. Not current ones, not the ledgers and road reports that were part of his official duties, but older ones. The founding documents of Harlow, the land grants, the deeds of sale dating back to the 1790s, the records of the old county court that had jurisdiction over this area before the town was incorporated. He requested documents from the county seat. He wrote many letters, though he kept copies of none that anyone could later locate. He was seen on at least 3 occasions walking the boundaries of various farms at the edge of town, measuring distances, comparing them to maps he carried folded in his coat. When asked what he was doing, he said he was conducting an audit of the town's property records. It was a plausible enough answer. He had done similar things before as treasurer. No one pressed him. In September of 1845, Edmund Farrow came to a council meeting and announced, without much ceremony, that he intended to write a letter. He said the letter would contain an account of certain matters he had uncovered in the course of his research, and he believed the council should be aware of its existence. He said the letter would be sealed and deposited with the town's official records and was not to be opened until every person currently living in Harlow had died. The council, to put it mildly, found this absurd. Councilman Frederick Haynes, whose family had been in Harlow since before the town had a name, remarked that Farrow had clearly spent too much time alone since Mrs. Patton's passing and perhaps he ought to consider taking a holiday. There was polite laughter. Another councilman, a man named Arthur Dunning, who had made his fortune in timber, said he had no intention of endorsing any document he was not permitted to read. Edmund Farrow said quietly that he was not asking anyone to endorse anything. He was merely notifying the council, as a courtesy, that the letter would exist. He handed the council a written statement describing the letter's existence, its location, and the conditions for its opening. He asked them to record it in the minutes. They did so reluctantly, with the general sense they were indulging a man who had grown eccentric in his grief. The letter was placed in a cedar box. The box was locked, and the key given to the town clerk with instructions that it be passed from clerk to clerk until the appointed time. Edmund Farrow himself kept no copy. He never spoke of the letter's contents to anyone. Not in any conversation that was ever recorded, and not apparently in any conversation that was ever remembered. He died in April of 1848, 3 years after sealing the letter. He was 50 years old. The doctor recorded the cause of death as heart failure. He left no will. His property, the house, the 12 acres, and a small amount of money, was divided among distant cousins he had never mentioned. The town attended his funeral in respectable numbers, said appropriate things about his service to the community, and returned to its business. The cedar box remained in the basement of the municipal hall. And Harlow continued living the story it had always told about itself. To understand what was in the letter, you must understand what Harlow was. And to understand what Harlow was, you must understand what it was built on. The Piedmont region of Virginia in the late 18th century was not the refined, orderly society that later generations would romanticize. It was raw and opportunistic, carved from a landscape that did not yield easily. The men who settled it were not all the upright pioneers of popular memory. Some were, but some were men who had come west from the Tidewater region precisely because the Tidewater had grown too settled, too watched, too governed. The Piedmont was a place where matters could be arranged discreetly without too many questions. Land in Virginia at that time was distributed through a system of grants and patents that was on paper carefully administered. In practice, it was chaos, overlapping claims, fraudulent surveys, forged signatures, and outright theft dressed in legal language. The county courts were staffed by the same men filing the land claims. The surveyors were often hired by the very people whose land they were measuring, and the records, where they existed at all, were maintained with a casualness that rendered them nearly useless as a check on dishonesty. The Haynes family, Frederick Haynes's forebears, had arrived in the region in 1791 with a land patent for 400 acres. By 1810, they owned 1,200. The expansion was documented in a series of deeds and purchases that appeared entirely legitimate. Each transaction had the required signatures, the required witnesses, the required notations. The land had passed from hand to hand in an orderly fashion, except that some of the people who had supposedly sold their land to the Haynes family did not appear anywhere else in the historical record after the date of the sale. They did not relocate to other parts of the county. They did not appear in the records of neighboring counties. They did not die in the county. Their deaths were not recorded. They simply ceased to appear. Their names existed in a single document, the deed of sale, and nowhere else. The Dunning family followed a similar pattern. Arthur Dunning's grandfather had arrived with a modest timber claim in 1803. By 1825, he controlled most of the timber-producing land in the northern part of what became Harlow. Some of that expansion was documented by purchases following the same pattern as the Haynes acquisitions, transactions with sellers who subsequently vanished from all records. And there was a third family, the Corrells, who had made their money less in land than in the labor that worked it. The Correll family had been among the earliest users of enslaved labor in the region, and their records, which Edmund Farrow had studied with particular care, contained a series of transactions that, when placed alongside the county court records and the local church registers, told a story darker and more precise than anyone in Harlow in 1845 had publicly acknowledged. This was not broadly unusual for Virginia in this period. The brutal economics of the era produced exactly these kinds of records. But the specific details Edmund Farrow had uncovered were not broadly about the era. They were specifically about Harlow, about the families who had founded it, governed it, named its streets and filled its council seats, and sat in the front pews of its church, about the precise mechanisms by which certain families had risen and others had disappeared, about documents that had been altered, records that had been selectively preserved, and at least 3 specific events involving specific people in specific places at specific times that the official record of Harlow had quietly erased. What those events were, we will get to that. But first, let us discuss what Edmund Farrow actually found. Because the letter did not merely make accusations, it made them with evidence, and the evidence was what made it devastating. Edmund Farrow was not by temperament or training a lawyer. He had no formal education beyond what was available in the county in the early 1800s, reading, writing, arithmetic, some Latin, some scripture. What he had instead was something rarer, the habit of comparison. He had spent 30 years handling the town's financial records, and in that time he had developed an almost involuntary tendency to cross-reference. When a number appeared in one ledger, he automatically checked it against related ledgers. When a name appeared in one document, he looked for it in others. He did not think of this as investigation. He thought of it as housekeeping, keeping the record straight, ensuring the accounts balanced. The problem was that in Harlow the accounts did not balance. He had noticed this years before Ruth Patton's death. Small discrepancies. Things that might have been clerical errors, might have been simple omissions, might have been nothing. He had noted them in his private papers and set them aside. After Ruth died, he found himself returning to those notes. It was perhaps a way of staying occupied. Perhaps it was something else, the sense that he owed it to her, that she had known things she had never fully said, that he had been too careful for too long. What he found, when he began to look in earnest, was a series of land transactions in the 1790s and early 1800s that could not be reconciled with any other part of the record. Specifically, there were 11 deeds of sale in the county records, documents by which various individuals had purportedly sold their land to the Haynes and Dunning families, that referenced witnesses who, when Farrow checked the church registers and the tax records and the road maintenance logs, had no other documented existence in the county. They were names that appeared on a single document and nowhere else. Not before, not after. This alone might have been explained in various ways. Record-keeping was inconsistent. People moved. People were missed. But Farrow did not stop there. He obtained through a contact at the county courthouse the original survey plat for several of the disputed tracts. Survey plats in Virginia at this time were required to include the name of the surveyor and the names of any chainmen, the assistants who held the measuring chain. Farrow compared the surveyors named on the disputed plats with the list of licensed surveyors recorded at the county level. 3 of the surveyors named on the disputed plats did not appear on the county's list of licensed surveyors. One of the plats bore a surveyor's name that could be matched to a real person. But that person had died 14 months before the survey was supposedly conducted. The implication was not subtle. The surveys were false. The deeds of sale that relied on those surveys were therefore suspect. And the land they described, land that was now the foundation of the Haynes and Dunning family holdings, land that had been in those families for 40 years, land that the town's entire sense of itself was built upon, had been acquired through fraud. But the land fraud, as bad as it was not the worst of what Farrow had found. The worst had to do with 3 specific people. 3 people whose names appeared in a set of documents that Farrow had uncovered in a very particular place. Not in the county courthouse, not in the town's official records, but in a private ledger that had belonged to a man named Harold Carell, the patriarch of the Carell family, and that had passed at his death in 1839 into the possession of his son William Carell, who had apparently not thought to destroy it, and who had left it, along with other business papers, in a locked trunk in the storage room of a building he owned, and occasionally rented to the town for civic functions. Farrow had access to that building in his capacity as town clerk. He had handled the rental paperwork, and when, in the course of sorting through the building's contents to prepare for a new tenant in the summer of 1844, he had come across the trunk, he had opened it. The trunk was not sealed. The lock was old and had long since lost its key, and the hasp could be lifted with a thumbnail. Farrow had opened it, found the ledger, and read it. What he read in that ledger, specific names, specific dates, specific transactions, and certain notations that were partly in a private shorthand, but decipherable with patience, constituted, as far as Pharaoh was able to determine, a record of 3 deaths. Not recorded deaths, not acknowledged deaths, the kind that do not appear in any church register or court record, because they were never meant to. The 3 people were a man named Samuel Oakes, who had owned a tract of 30 acres on the western edge of what became Harlow, a woman named Margaret Voss, who had been employed in the Carell household, and a man whose full name Pharaoh was never able to determine, referred to in Harold Carell's ledger only by a first name, James, and by a notation that suggested he had been for a period of time attempting to bring a claim against the Carell family in the county court. Samuel Oakes's land now belonged to the Haynes family. It had been transferred via a deed of sale dated February 1802, a deed with no witnesses whose names could be found elsewhere. Samuel Oakes himself had no recorded history after January 1802. Margaret Voss had worked in the Carell house from approximately 1800 to 1803. She appeared in the household account records for that period. Payments recorded, duties described. After 1803, she was gone. Not dismissed, not departed, not recorded anywhere. Harold Carell's ledger contained an entry for the summer of 1803 that Pharaoh had decoded after considerable effort to read, matter of MV, resolved at the Gileham property. No further correspondence. The Gileham property was a tract of undeveloped woodland about 3 miles east of what became the town centre. By 1845, it was owned by the Carell family themselves. James, only James, had apparently sometime around 1807 or 1808 been preparing to file suit against Harold Carell over the terms of a labour contract. There was a letter in the trunk, unsigned and unaddressed, that described the situation in terms that made clear the writer believed the suit would be damaging. 2 ledger entries followed, dated 4 months apart. The second one read, J. Matter closed. No proceedings anticipated. Pharaoh did not know for certain what had happened to these 3 people. He had no bodies. He had no witnesses. He had a ledger written in the private shorthand of a man who had been dead for 6 years, and a series of absences, conspicuous documented absences that were consistent with one reading of events and not easily explained by any other. What the letter contained, as he wrote it in the autumn of 1845, was not a formal accusation. It was a presentation of the evidence he had gathered, organized as carefully as any financial audit, and addressed, he wrote this explicitly on the sealed envelope, to whoever in Harlow's future was prepared to face what its past had actually been. He wrote the letter in 3 sittings. It took him the better part of a week. He sealed it with black wax on a Thursday evening in October, carried it to the municipal hall on Friday morning, placed it in the cedar box, and handed the box to the town clerk with the instructions already on record. Then he walked home. He made himself a cup of tea. He sat by his window and looked out at Harlow, at the road he had helped pave, the church he had helped fund, the council hall whose charter he had written. And whatever he felt in that moment he kept entirely to himself, as he had kept everything else. Now before we go any further, if this story is making you think, drop a like and let us know your theory in the comments. What do you believe Edmund Pharaoh truly discovered? And was he right to seal that letter rather than speak? Keep listening because what we have uncovered so far is only the foundation. What comes next is where the story truly begins to unravel. The years passed. Harlow grew as small Virginia towns grew in the middle decades of the 19th century, unevenly, with bursts of energy followed by long stretches of quiet. The railroad came through the county in 1851, cutting 6 miles south of town in a decision that benefited the larger market town of Culper and left Harlow slightly to the side of things. The tobacco economy softened. Several of the older families diversified into other enterprises, grain milling, small-scale manufacturing, the kind of commercial activity that suited a town no longer able to rely on a single crop. The Civil War, when it came, passed through Harlow without the direct catastrophe that struck other parts of Virginia. though it took its tithe in young men and left the economy in a condition that required years to recover. The founding families endured. The Haynes remained prominent, their land reduced from the peak years but still substantial, their presence in the town's civic life continuous, their name on the deed of the oldest church and the largest parcel of what had once been common ground. The Dunnings had mostly moved away by the 1870s, though a branch of the family returned in the 1890s and re-established itself with modest success in the hardware trade. The Corrells had declined sharply in the aftermath of the war, their labor-based wealth stripped away, their patriarch's generation aging out, their younger members scattered. By 1900, the Correll name in Harlow was largely a historical echo, mentioned in connection with an old house now privately owned and a small plot of land that had been deeded to the town for use as a park. Through all of this, the cedar box sat in the basement of the municipal hall. Clerks came and went. Two of them apparently had no clear memory of the box's significance. They knew it was in their custody, knew it had instructions attached, but had either not read the instructions carefully or not taken them seriously. One clerk, a man named Charles Brent, who served from 1879 to 1893, had apparently opened the box and examined the exterior of the sealed envelope, made a note that it existed, and replaced it without opening the letter itself. His note, which was found in the same file as the original 1845 council minutes, said, "Cedar box containing sealed document per Pharaoh instructions. Condition intact. No grounds for opening at present." Brent had clearly read the instructions. He had honored them. He had simply not thought from the record to explain them to anyone. By 1910, the municipal hall had been renovated. The basement had been cleared and reorganized. The cedar box had been moved to the County Records Annex, a newer building a block away, where it was catalogued among a collection of historical municipal documents. The catalogue entry read, "Box, Duma 47, Harlow Town Records, Miscellaneous, late 1800s. There was no specific mention of a sealed letter or its conditions. Whoever had transferred the box had either missed or forgotten the instruction document, which had apparently been kept loose inside the box rather than firmly attached to it. This was how for the next 2 decades, the letter nearly escaped notice altogether. It sat in box number 47 among tax records from the 1880s and road survey reports from the 1870s in a building that was consulted primarily by lawyers researching property titles and the occasional genealogist. 3 people at least handled the box during this period without ever realizing the sealed envelope inside it was anything other than a piece of uncatalogued correspondence. 2 of them set it aside. One of them, a young clerk named Percy Howell, who worked at the annex in the early 1920s, actually tried to open it out of curiosity before noticing the wax seal and deciding it looked too official to tamper with. He mentioned it afterward to his supervisor, who made a note to investigate its origin. The investigation was never completed. Percy Howell left the annex for a position in Charlottesville. His supervisor was transferred. The note sat in a file. But in 1931, a new town archivist named Dorothy Stokes was appointed. She was by all accounts an extraordinary woman for her time, 40 years old, the widow of a schoolteacher, possessed of a methodical and slightly obsessive commitment to the accuracy of historical records. She had no formal training in archival science. She had learned it herself through practice and through correspondence with the State Library in Richmond. She took the annex and its collection more seriously than anyone had in years. Dorothy Stokes found Box 47 in the summer of her first year. She found the sealed envelope inside it. She found tucked behind a loose board in the back of the box that no one had apparently noticed, the original instruction document from the 1845 council meeting, the written statement in Edmund Pharaoh's own hand describing the conditions of the letter's opening. She read it twice. Then she sat it down. Then she read it again. The condition was specific. The letter was not to be opened until every person who had lived in Harlow during the lifetime of the letter's author had died. The letter had been written in 1845. Pharaoh had been born in 1798. The question then was whether anyone still living had been alive in Harlow at some point before 1845. Dorothy Stokes did the arithmetic and realized with a slight chill that it was entirely possible that someone still qualified. A person born in Harlow in say 1844 would have been alive during Pharaoh's lifetime and would now be in 1931 approximately 87 years old. Not impossible, unlikely, but not impossible. She began to look. What followed was 5 years of painstaking research, not conducted continuously, but woven into her regular archival work, in which Dorothy Stokes attempted to establish whether any person meeting the specified condition was still living. She consulted church birth and death records going back to the 1790s. She wrote to the families of long-established Harlow residents. She reviewed census records. She was in essence doing exactly what Edmund Pharaoh had done 60 years earlier, cross-referencing, comparing, building a careful picture from disparate sources. She found 2 people who might qualify. One was a man named Elias Granger who had been born in Harlow in 1841 and was thus 4 years old when the letter was sealed. By 1931, he was 90. She tracked him to a nursing home in Fredericksburg. He died there in December 1932. The second was a woman named Louisa Haynes. Louisa Haynes was the last surviving member of the Haynes family. She had been born in Harlow in 1842, 3 years before the letter was sealed, which meant that she had technically lived in Harlow during Pharaoh's lifetime. She was by 1931, 89 years old. She still lived in Harlow in the old Haynes house on Maple Street, attended by a nurse and by her great-niece, a woman named Clara Haynes, who had married into the family and was the last Haynes in residence. Dorothy Stokes found her, interviewed her gently about family history, about memories of the old town. Louisa Haynes, despite her age, was sharp. She remembered the Pharaoh name. She said her father had spoken of him, not with fondness, but not with hostility either. A careful man, she said, too careful for his own peace of mind. Dorothy Stokes did not tell Louisa Haynes about the letter. She simply waited. Louisa Haynes died on the 14th of February, 1936 at the age of 93. She was the last survivor. Dorothy Stokes notified the town clerk 3 days later. She brought him Pharaoh's original instruction document. She brought him box number 47 with the sealed envelope inside. She set them both on his desk and said, "I believe it is time." The clerk, a man named Walter Gibbs, 52 years old, a practical and unimaginative man who had held the position for 11 years, looked at the envelope, looked at the instruction document, and looked at Dorothy Stokes. He asked her if she was certain about the chain of documentation, whether she was confident this was what it purported to be. She said she had spent 5 years verifying it. She was certain. Walter Gibbs scheduled the opening for Thursday, March 12, 1936. He invited 6 witnesses. The mayor of Harlow, a man named George Tatum, the county circuit court judge, 2 members of the town council, the editor of the Harlow Courier, a local newspaper, and Dorothy Stokes herself. He arranged for the event to take place in the council chamber of the municipal hall, the same building where Edmund Pharaoh had once served, though the building itself had been replaced by a newer structure in 1904. On the afternoon of March 12, 1936, 91 years and 5 months after Edmund Pharaoh had sealed the wax, Walter Gibbs broke it open. The room was plain and functional, a rectangular space with oak paneling that had darkened over the decades, 2 long windows facing the street, and a table in the center that had seen 30 years of budget discussions and zoning disputes. There were 8 chairs around the table. 7 of the chairs were occupied. On the table in the center was the envelope. Walter Gibbs had prepared a formal statement acknowledging the chain of custody and the conditions of opening. He read it aloud. It took 4 minutes. The judge confirmed the documentation was in order. The editor of the Courier, a man named Francis Dyer, who had been covering local news for 20 years and had never in his life covered anything that felt like this, had a notepad in front of him and was writing before the envelope was even opened. The envelope was made of heavy paper, the kind used for official correspondence in the 1840s. Thicker than modern envelopes, slightly rough to the touch, slightly yellowed along the edges, but otherwise remarkably preserved by the cedar box and the dry basement. The black wax seal had held. Gibbs broke it with a letter opener. The seal cracked cleanly, the way old wax does when it has never been disturbed. A sound witnesses later reported was oddly loud in the quiet room. One councilman, a man named Howard Pierce, later told his wife that the sound of that wax cracking was something he would hear in his sleep for the rest of his life. Inside the envelope were 7 folded sheets of paper covered on both sides in Edmund Farrow's small, precise handwriting. The ink had faded from black to a dark brown, but it was legible. Perfectly, maddeningly legible. Walter Gibbs read it aloud. It took 38 minutes. The room, by the account of 3 of the 7 witnesses, was absolutely silent for the first 10 minutes. Then the mayor made a sound, not a word, just a sound, low and involuntary. And after that, no one spoke again until Gibbs finished reading. What Farrow had written was this. He began with the land surveys, the false ones, the names of surveyors who did not exist, the witnesses on deeds who could not be found in any other record. He was careful to acknowledge that he could not, from the records available to him, establish absolute certainty. Some of the absences might have innocent explanations, but he laid out the pattern. 11 transactions, all within a 15-year window, all involving the same 2 families, all showing the same characteristic irregularities. He named specific parcels. He cited specific document numbers in the county record. He named specific dates. He was precise in a way that made it clear he had spent years on this, that he had checked and rechecked, that he was not writing from anger or grief, but from the same meticulous accounting practice that had made him the town's most reliable treasurer. Then he moved to the Correll ledger. He described how he had found it. He described what it contained. He acknowledged directly and without softening that he could not prove murder, that the word he was using was disappearance, and that the records he had found were consistent with death by foul means, but not conclusive. He named Samuel Oakes. He named Margaret Voss. He named James with the notation that he had never been able to determine a surname. He described the ledger entries and what they appeared to mean. And then the part that silenced the room most completely, he wrote about what he believed connected the land fraud and the disappearances. Margaret Voss, he wrote, had been employed in the Correll household at the same time that several of the disputed land transactions were being finalized. She had been, he believed, a witness. Not a legal witness, not someone named on a document, but a human witness, someone who had been in the room or in the vicinity when things were arranged that were not meant to be witnessed. The entry in Harold Correll's ledger that referred to her as a matter resolved at the Guileham property came 3 months after the last of the disputed land transactions in that cluster. Whatever she had seen or known, she had apparently at some point indicated that she was aware of it. Samuel Oakes had resisted selling his 30 acres. There were entries in a county court record, a record that Farrow had found in a box of unfiled papers at the courthouse, apparently misfiled decades ago, indicating that Oakes had appeared before a magistrate in late 1801 to dispute a survey of his land that he claimed was inaccurate. The magistrate's response was recorded as claim reviewed and found without merit. The magistrate who reviewed it was a man named Daniel Haynes, Frederick Haynes's grandfather. James, whoever he was, had tried to pursue a legal remedy for a wrong done to him by the Correll family, and had by Farrow's accounting been prevented from doing so in a manner that suggested the prevention was permanent. Farrow did not use inflammatory language. He did not write with passion or rage. He wrote the way he had always worked, methodically, economically, without embellishment. The facts he presented were the argument. He made no explicit call for any particular action. He wrote that he had sealed the letter rather than spoken its contents because he had concluded after long consideration that speaking it in his own lifetime would accomplish nothing except to destroy him without helping anyone the destruction was meant to help. The families he named were powerful. The evidence he held, though substantial, was circumstantial. The people who had suffered were gone, and no legal remedy was possible. But the record, he wrote, should not be allowed to remain false. Harlow should not be allowed to continue believing and telling its children that its founding families had built their place in the world through honest work and fair dealing. Someone in the future ought to know the truth, even if the future could do no more with it than the past could. He ended the letter with a single sentence that several witnesses apparently could not read without their voice changing. "I have lived in this town my whole life. I have kept its accounts and drawn its boundaries and signed its documents. I have done my best to leave the record straight. This letter is the last thing in the record that was not." Walter Gibbs set down the 7 pages. He looked at the room. He said nothing. For a long moment, neither did anyone else. It was the judge who spoke first. He asked to see the pages. Gibbs passed them to him. The judge read through them, not aloud, just to himself, slowly. And when he was done, he set them down and put his hands flat on the table and said in a voice that Francis Dyer would quote exactly in the Courier the following morning, "Lord Almighty, he knew. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Harlow, Virginia only deepens. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with someone who loves dark mysteries from American history. Hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss a story like this. Because what happens next, what this letter does to the living, is something no one in Harlow saw coming." Francis Dyer published his account of the opening the following morning, Friday, March 13, 1936, on the front page of the Harlow Courier. He did not publish the full text of the letter. He had, at the request of the judge and the mayor, agreed to hold back the specific names of the Correll, Haynes, and Dunning families until the legal questions could be assessed. What he published was a careful factual account of the opening itself, the date, the location, the chain of custody, the approximate content, and the single quotation from the judge. He described the letter as containing allegations of historical fraud and possible criminal conduct by founding families of Harlow, supported by documentary evidence. That was enough. By Friday afternoon, the story had spread through Harlow with the particular velocity that small-town news achieves when it touches something everyone already half knows. People who had never heard of Edmund Farrow were standing on street corners asking their neighbors who Edmund Farrow was. People who knew the Haynes name, and everyone in Harlow knew the Haynes name, were looking at each other with expressions that communicated without words the question that the letter had made unavoidable. If this is true, what does that make us? Clara Haynes, who was 46 and had been Louisa's great-niece and caretaker, was at home when the paper arrived. She read it once and put it on her kitchen table. She did not go out that day. By Saturday morning, she had received 3 calls and 2 visitors, people she knew well, people she had sat next to in church for 20 years. And all 3 calls and both visitors in one way or another found a way to avoid the specific subject while making clear they were aware of it. One neighbor, a woman who had been Clara's closest friend for 15 years, came to the door on the pretext of returning a borrowed dish and spent 20 minutes talking about the weather and the spring planting and did not once meet Clara's eyes. That night, Saturday night, Clara Haynes drove to the annex where Dorothy Stokes worked. The annex was closed, but Clara had Dorothy's home address from a Christmas card exchange. She went to her house. Dorothy Stokes answered the door in her house dress, surprised. Clara was calm. She did not shout. She asked in a steady voice whether Dorothy had known what was in the letter before she had arranged for it to be opened. Dorothy said she had not. She had known that the letter existed and that it contained allegations of some kind, but she had not known the specific content. Clara asked, had Dorothy thought to consider what effect the letter might have on families that were still present in Harlow? Dorothy said she had. She said she had thought about it carefully. She said that Edmund Farrow had spent the last years of his life ensuring the letter would be opened and that it was not her place to override a decision he had made with such deliberate intention. Clara Haynes looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "The people he accused have been dead for 100 years. Dorothy Stokes said, "Yes, but the record he was correcting is still alive." Clara went home. She did not speak publicly about the letter after that. She did not contest it, did not deny it, did not ask the town to reconsider. She simply went quiet in the way that people go quiet when they understand that the argument has already been decided and that continuing it would only prolong the damage. But the damage was not quiet. The mayor, George Tatum, whose family had no direct connection to the named families, but who had held his office for 8 years on the goodwill of the town's established interests, resigned the following Monday. He cited health reasons. Those who knew him said he had not slept in 4 days. His resignation letter was 6 lines long and said nothing that anyone would remember. Howard Pierce, one of the 2 councilmen present at the opening, announced that he would not seek re-election in November. He was 60 years old and had served on the council for 12 years. He told his daughter, who repeated it carefully years later, that he had known for a long time that the founding of the town was not a clean story, but that knowing something vaguely and having it read aloud to you from a 91-year-old document with specific names and specific dates were 2 entirely different experiences. The circuit court judge, the third of the officials present that day to take visible damage, found himself in a position of particular difficulty. His name was Robert Enfield, and he was the grandson of a man who had served as county attorney in the 1880s. His grandfather had in that role supervised the Land Records Office at a time when several of the parcels named in Pharaoh's letter had changed hands again. Transitions that, if the original acquisitions were fraudulent, would themselves be tainted. Judge Enfield had no personal culpability for anything, but the implication, the implicit question of what his grandfather had known or not known, followed him in a way that professional conduct alone could not deflect. He remained on the bench. He was a careful man, and he understood that resigning would imply guilt where there was in his own case none. But the year after the letter's opening was, by his own account in a private diary that his family later shared with a local historian, the most uncomfortable of his professional life. The Dunning family, whose connection to the fraud was established in the letter, had no significant presence left in Harlow by 1936. A branch of the family was notified by letter by Francis Dyer, who tracked them to a town in the Shenandoah Valley. The response was silence. No comment, no denial, no acknowledgement. The Carell connection, the ledger, the disappearances, the 3 names, was the element that produced the most complicated response because the Carell family had no living member to receive it. The Carell house was privately owned by a family with no relation. The land that Harold Carell had once controlled was by 1936 parceled across multiple owners, some of whom were not Harlow residents at all. There was no one to confront. There was only the fact sitting in the middle of the town's history like a stone in a garden path, not covering anything, not hiding anything, simply unavoidable. Dorothy Stokes in the weeks after the opening compiled a supplementary document, a careful annotation of Pharaoh's letter, cross-referencing his claims against the record she had been able to locate and verify. She found that his land fraud evidence held up entirely. Every specific claim he had made about the surveys and the deed witnesses was verifiable. And she found 2 additional suspicious transactions that Pharaoh had not mentioned, probably because they were in documents he had not been able to access. She found that the Carell ledger, which she was able to examine since it was now officially part of the town's historical records, was consistent with Pharaoh's reading of it, though she acknowledged, as he had, that the shorthand entries did not constitute proof in any legal sense. On the 3 disappearances, Oakes, Voss, and the man called James, she was unable to find any additional evidence that resolved the ambiguity. Samuel Oakes had a family. She found descendants through the 1870 census, a granddaughter in Richmond, a great-nephew in North Carolina. She wrote to both of them. Neither response added anything concrete to what was already known. The granddaughter was unaware that her grandfather had owned land in what was now Harlow. The great-nephew was unaware that there had ever been any dispute. Both of them in their responses used similar language. They had always been told that the family had simply moved away sometime around 1802 or 1803 and had not stayed in touch, had simply moved away. A town's identity is not a simple thing. It is built over generations through repetition, through the same names on the same buildings, the same families in the same pews, the same stories told at the same annual celebrations. Harlow had been doing this for nearly 100 years by the time the letter was opened. And the story it had built was the one that most American towns of its kind had built. A narrative of hard-working, principled men who had carved order from wilderness through their own virtue and labor. The founding families were not depicted as perfect. Small-town mythology is usually too honest for that. But they were depicted as fundamentally decent, as men who had built something real and lasting. The letter did not say that everything about those men was a lie. Edmund Farrow had been too careful for that. He had identified specific fraudulent acts, specific victims, specific evidence. He had not claimed that every acre the Haynes family owned was stolen, only that certain specific transactions were fraudulent. He had not claimed that Harold Carell had certainly killed anyone, only that the evidence was consistent with it, and that the absence of records was suspicious in a specific and documentable way. But the effect on the town's self-image was not limited to the specifics. The specifics were a door. Once opened, the door let in the broader question. If this is what was underneath the surface of the founding story, how much else was underneath? If the surveys were fraudulent and the deed witnesses were invented, what did that mean for the land records that everyone in Harlow relied on for their property rights? If Margaret Voss and Samuel Oakes had been, as Farrow implied, killed or made to disappear, who had known and stayed silent? How many people in 1802 or 1807 had understood what was happening and simply looked the other way because the families involved were too powerful to confront? These questions did not produce legal consequences. The fraud was too old. The crimes, if they were crimes, were beyond any statute. The land had changed hands too many times for any practical remedy to be imagined. Nobody went to prison. Nobody paid restitution. The town did not hold a formal hearing or make a formal acknowledgement. What it did instead was something quieter and in some ways more damaging. It stopped being certain of itself. The annual Founders' Day celebration, held every August since 1885 with speeches about the town's history and a parade and a picnic on the green, was cancelled in 1936. The official reason given was budget concerns, and there were budget concerns. The Depression still bearing down on small-town Virginia with real force. But Francis Dyer wrote an editorial in the Courier in July of that year, noting that the cancellation had been decided 2 weeks after the letter's opening, and that perhaps the town might wish to take the occasion not to cancel the celebration, but to revise it, to tell a fuller story, to include the names and histories that had been absent from the official account. The town council did not respond to the editorial. Founders' Day was not held in 1936. It was held again in 1937 with a scaled-down program and without the traditional historical address that had in previous years celebrated the town's founding families. The name Haynes appeared on no plaque that was dedicated after 1936. The street that bore the Dunning name, Dunning Road, which ran north from the center of town, was quietly renamed in 1941 when the road was improved and the signs replaced. The new name, Ridgecrest Avenue, was chosen without ceremony or public discussion. These were small acts, barely visible from the outside. But to those in Harlow who were paying attention, and there were a few, they represented something significant, the beginning of a slow, unacknowledged reckoning. The town could not undo what had been done. It could not restore what had been taken from Samuel Oakes or Margaret Voss or the man called James. It could not give those people back their land or their lives or their names in a proper register, but it could quietly, without drama, over years and decades, begin to stop celebrating the people who had taken them. Dorothy Stokes continued her work. She compiled over the following years a full archive of the documents related to the letter. Farrow's original, her annotations, the records she had found and verified, the correspondence with the descendants of Samuel Oakes. She organized it into a proper archival collection, filed it under its own reference number, and wrote a finding aid that described its contents in plain language. She did not try to force the town to do anything with it. She simply ensured that whoever came to look would find it intact, properly organized, and clearly explained. She retired from the annex in 1954 after 23 years. At her retirement ceremony, attended by most of the town's civic community, she was given a clock and a framed certificate and a speech by the new town clerk that praised her thoroughness and her dedication without specifically mentioning the cedar box or what she had done with it. She accepted graciously and said that the work of an archivist was simply to ensure that the truth of the past remained available to the present and that she was glad to have done it. Nobody applauded that sentence. Nobody heckled it either. It simply fell into the room and sat there the way certain true things do. Of the three people Edmund Farrow had named in his letter, Samuel Oakes, Margaret Voss, and James, it is the fate of Margaret Voss that history in its partial and fragmentary way has allowed us to know the most about. Margaret Voss had come to the Carrel household in approximately 1800. She was, by the best reconstruction available from the household records, somewhere between 20 and 30 years old at the time, old enough to have been hired as a senior domestic worker responsible for the management of the household's daily tasks. She appears in the Carrel accounts as a paid employee, which was unusual for the era when most domestic labor in Virginia households of that status was performed by enslaved people. The Carrel family did own enslaved workers. This is documented clearly in the census records. But Margaret Voss was something different. She was white, free, and paid. This distinction mattered in the record, and it mattered to Edmund Farrow, who had been careful to note it. Why was she paid? One possibility, the most obvious, was that she performed a role that required a degree of personal discretion that the Carrels preferred to ensure through the economic relationship of wage employment rather than the coercive relationship of enslavement. A housekeeper who was paid could, in theory, be trusted with certain matters precisely because she had something to lose and something to gain. She was not entirely powerless, not entirely dependent in the way that enslaved workers were. She had a degree of autonomy. The problem, of course, was that this autonomy cut both ways. She could also, if she chose, leave. She could talk. The household accounts record her presence through the summer of 1803. The last entry referencing her wages is dated August 11, 1803. There is no record of her dismissal, no record of her departure, no record of any final payment. The account simply stops mentioning her. In the church register for the county, a record that Dorothy Stokes had studied exhaustively, there is no burial entry for a Margaret Voss. There is no marriage entry. There is no baptism, no confirmation, no entry of any kind. She had existed in the household accounts and in nothing else. She had no property in her own name, no tax record, no legal appearance. She was, as far as the official record was concerned, a name attached to a line in an account book, and nothing more. Farrow had found one additional reference to her, a single line in a letter from Harold Carrel to his brother, written in the summer of 1803, about 3 weeks before the last wage entry. The original letter was in the trunk with the ledger. It said, in the context of what appeared to be a broader discussion of household management, the Voss matter has become inconvenient. I have discussed options with F.H. and we are agreed on the appropriate resolution. F.H., Frederick Haynes's grandfather, the man whose family had acquired Samuel Oakes's land. Farrow had transcribed that line in the letter. He had not drawn an explicit conclusion from it. He had simply placed it beside the ledger entry that said matter of MV resolved at the Guileham property and let the juxtaposition speak. The Guileham property, 3 miles east of town in a stretch of woodland that had passed to the Carrels by 1810, was never excavated. Dorothy Stokes noted in her supplementary document that she had considered raising the question of a formal search of the property with the county authorities, but that the absence of any surviving legal standard for what the evidence would prove had led her to conclude that such a search was beyond the scope of her archival work. She wrote, "Whether the answer to the question of Margaret Voss's fate lies in the Guileham property, I cannot say. I can only say that the evidence Edmund Farrow assembled points in that direction more clearly than in any other. Samuel Oakes is somewhat easier to trace in the sense that his disappearance left more behind it. He had a family, a wife whose name in the fragmentary records appears to be Hannah, and at least 2 children. The county court record that Pharaoh had found, the one indicating Oakes's appearance before a magistrate to contest the survey of his land, also contained a subsequent entry 3 months later noting that the case had been dismissed and that the complainant had withdrawn his claim. The word withdrawn was suggestive. People who withdrew their claims did so for a reason. Either they had been persuaded their claim was without merit, or they had been persuaded by other means to stop pursuing it. 4 months after the withdrawal of his claim, Samuel Oakes's name appeared for the last time in any record. A notation in the road maintenance log indicating that the road adjacent to his property needed repair and that the adjacent landowner should be notified. The notation was never followed up. There is no record that he was notified. There is no record that he did anything in response. He simply ceased to appear. Hannah Oakes, if that was her name, appears once more in the 1810 census, living in a different county with 2 children in a household headed by a man with a different surname. She had apparently remarried. The census gives no information about what had happened to her first husband. The children's ages in 1810 are consistent with having been born in the early 1800s, which fits the timeline of Samuel Oakes's presence in Harlow. The fact that she moved, changed county, changed name, was in the calculus of practical survival in early 19th century Virginia, entirely consistent with either version of events. A widow with 2 children and no land would have needed to remarry. A woman whose husband had been made to disappear under circumstances she understood to be dangerous would have had excellent reasons to get as far away as possible as quickly and quietly as possible. Pharaoh had noted this. He had noted it without sentiment, the way he noted everything he had written. Whether Hannah Oakes fled or merely rebuilt, the record does not tell us. I think she knew. I think the distance she put between herself and this town tells us what words could not. As for James, only James with no surname. Pharaoh had been able to establish almost nothing concrete beyond what the Corel ledger contained. The labor contract dispute that James had apparently been pursuing in 1807 or 1808 would have been, in the legal context of the time, a matter for the county court. There were county court records for that period, but they were incomplete. Several years of filings had been lost in a courthouse fire in 1822, and 1807 and 1808 fell squarely in the gap. Pharaoh had tried to reconstruct the case through related records, clerk's fees, attorney logs, anything that might reference the case indirectly, and had found nothing. James existed in the ledger and nowhere else. This was the most frightening aspect of James's story in some ways. Samuel Oakes and Margaret Voss had left partial traces, a contested land survey, household wages, a fragment of correspondence. James had left only 2 entries in a private ledger written in a dead man's shorthand in a trunk that had sat locked, or nearly locked, for 40 years. If Pharaoh had not opened that trunk, if Dorothy Stokes had not found Pharaoh's letter, if Percy Howell had not decided the envelope looked too official to open, if any of a dozen small decisions along the chain had gone differently, James would have left nothing at all. He would have been a person of whom no record existed, whose disappearance no one had noticed or documented, whose name even his killer had reduced to a single initial. Pharaoh had written near the end of the letter about this specific aspect of the situation. He wrote, "The most dangerous thing about what happened here is not the fraud or even the violence. The most dangerous thing is how easy it was to erase people, not bodies. I make no claim about bodies, but existence. The simple fact of a person's having lived and worked and sought justice in this place. It took one fraudulent document, one cooperative magistrate, one locked trunk, and the people who should be remembered as men and women who tried to build something honest in this county were simply not there anymore. Harlow was built on the premise that the founding generation deserved to be remembered. I would ask only that we extend that courtesy more honestly. Before we reach the final chapter of this story, I need to ask you something. Do you think Edmund Pharaoh made the right choice, sealing that letter instead of speaking it? Or did 91 years of silence cost more than it saved? Leave your answer in the comments. Subscribe if you haven't yet and hit the bell so you don't miss what comes next. because the ending of this story is not the one you think it is. There is one more thing about Edmund Farrow that the historical record allows us to know, or nearly know. And it is the thing that makes the letter's existence feel in retrospect not merely like an act of historical honesty, but like something more personal. Something that explains why a man who had spent 30 years keeping quiet had in the end found himself incapable of letting the record stay false. Ruth Paton had died in October 1843. Edmund Farrow had been at her bedside. After her death, he had returned home and remained absent from public life for 3 weeks. When he came back, he had begun quietly and systematically to go through old records. The question that Dorothy Stokes had spent a considerable amount of time on, and that she had addressed in the final section of her supplementary document in language more personal than her usual archival style, was this. Why did Ruth Paton's death send Edmund Farrow into the old records? What was the connection? Dorothy Stokes had found part of the answer in a letter. Not the sealed letter, but a different one. A personal letter from Edmund Farrow to his cousin in Richmond, written in December 1843, 2 months after Ruth's death. It was in the cousin's family papers, which had been donated to the State Historical Society in the 1920s. Dorothy had found it there during one of her research trips to Richmond. The letter was about various family matters, the farm, finances, the cousin's children, and it contained near the end a single paragraph that Dorothy had copied out in full in her supplementary document. I find myself returning these past weeks to a conversation I had with Ruth some years ago, the details of which I never sat down, because at the time I believed she was exaggerating, or that the matter was already too settled to be worth pursuing. She told me something about the Correll house and about a woman who had worked there in her mother's time. Her mother had known this woman slightly, and Ruth had carried the knowledge of her for years without knowing what to do with it. I did not take it seriously enough when she was living to do what I should have done. I intend now to make that right. He had not taken it seriously enough. Ruth Paton had known something about Margaret Voss or about what had happened at the Correll house, passed down through her mother's memory, and she had told Farrow, and Farrow had not acted on it, and then she had died. This is the part of the story that the formal record does not quite capture. Edmund Farrow had spent his whole life watching Harlow, keeping its accounts, ensuring its documents were accurate. He had been, in his professional capacity, meticulous and principled, but he had also been, like everyone else in Harlow, a man of his time and place, with his time and place's particular talent for not seeing what it was inconvenient to see. Ruth Paton had told him something. He had not listened closely enough, and she had died carrying the knowledge that he had been too careful, too comfortable in his position to help her with. The letter was not merely a historical correction. It was an act of obligation. The fulfillment, years late, of something he owed to a dead woman who had trusted him with a secret she had carried her whole life. Dorothy Stokes wrote about this. Edmund Farrow was not a hero of this story. He was a man who knew too much too late and who did what he could with the time he had left. The letter was his attempt to do what he had failed to do when it might have made a difference. Perhaps it is something. Perhaps it is not enough. I am not sure those two things are mutually exclusive. The full text of Farrow's letter was published in the Harlow Courier on April 3, 1936, 3 weeks after the opening, delayed by discussions that were never fully made public about whether publication was responsible. Francis Dyer had held it back at the request of the judge and the mayor, but the mayor had resigned. The judge had declined to further request its suppression, and Dyer had concluded, correctly, as most would agree in retrospect, that the letter belonged to the public record. The day the full text was published, the Courier sold out its print run of 800 copies before noon. A second printing was ordered. People who had never bought the Courier subscribed that week. The letter, Farrow's careful, meticulous, absolutely devastating letter, was read in barbershops and kitchens and on front porches all over town, and the conversation it produced was of a kind that Harlow had not had before, direct, specific, historical, and impossible to resolve. Some people responded with anger. The anger was not always directed at the Haynes or Correll or Dunning families, the families who had committed the frauds and by implication the worst things. Some of it was directed at Pharaoh, at the choice he had made to seal the letter rather than speak it in his lifetime, at the 91 years of silence that had allowed generation after generation to grow up with a false story. Some of it was directed at the town clerk's office, which had maintained the letter without telling anyone it existed. Some of it was directed with a particular bitterness at the families themselves. Not the individual members of 1936, most of whom had no personal responsibility for anything, but at the institution of those families, at the way their names and their prominence had functioned for a century, as a kind of moral endorsement of a history that was not what it had appeared to be. Some people responded with denial, not many, but some. A letter was published in the Courier a week after the full text, signed by 7 Harlow residents, arguing that Pharaoh had been a bitter and eccentric man, that his evidence was circumstantial, that the land fraud allegations were unprovable after a century, and that publishing the letter without proper legal evaluation was irresponsible. Francis Dyer printed the letter and in his editorial response noted that the documents Pharaoh cited were in the public record and available for anyone to examine, that Dorothy Stokes's supplementary document had verified the land fraud evidence in full, and that the question of whether the allegations were legally actionable was separate from the question of whether they were true. The denial letters slowed and then stopped. Not because the people who had written them had changed their minds, but because the other evidence, Dorothy Stokes's annotations, the surveyor records, the deed witnesses who didn't exist, was too specific to be dismissed. The facts were facts. The question was only what to do with them. What the town did in the end was something gradual and incomplete and more honest than it might have been. The Historical Society, which had previously published a pamphlet about Harlow's founding families that Dorothy Stokes had long considered inadequate, withdrew the pamphlet from circulation in 1937 and spent 2 years producing a new one. The new pamphlet included a section on Edmund Pharaoh and the letter. It included a section on the land fraud and the fraudulent surveys. It included, briefly and carefully, a section on the 3 people who had disappeared, Samuel Oakes, Margaret Voss, and the man referred to only as James, noting that the evidence of what had happened to them was incomplete but troubling. The pamphlet did not use the word murder. Dorothy Stokes had advised against it. She had argued that using the word without the evidence to fully support it would give those who wished to discredit the entire account a legitimate target. The word it used instead was disappearance, and it used it precisely as Pharaoh had, noting that the circumstances of the disappearances were consistent with foul play without claiming certainty. The pamphlet was placed in the library, in the annex, in the County Historical Society's collection. It was not widely publicized. It did not receive the attention that Pharaoh's letter had received in 1936, but it was there and it was accurate, and it was the first official historical document produced by Harlow that acknowledged on the record, in print, with specific names and dates, that the town's founding story was not the one it had always told. Clara Haynes read the pamphlet. She was 50 by then, and she had spent the intervening years in a kind of deliberate, steady withdrawal from the town's public life. Not fleeing it, not repudiating it, but reducing her presence in a way that suggested she understood that the family name she bore carried a weight that she could not put down, but could choose not to display. She continued to live in the house on Maple Street. She continued to attend the church she had always attended, but she stopped sitting on the vestry. She stopped accepting the invitations to civic events that her position would previously have brought automatically. She became, by choice, an ordinary resident of Harlow. No more prominent than anyone else, no less. Many years later, in the early 1950s, a historian from the University of Virginia who was researching land fraud in pre-Civil War Virginia came to Harlow to examine the Pharaoh collection. He spent 3 days in the annex reading through the original letter, Dorothy Stokes's annotations, and all the supporting documents. On his last day, he spoke to Clara Haynes, who agreed to see him briefly. He asked her, as a matter of historical record, whether she had any documents in the family's possession that related to the events described in Pharaoh's letter. She said she had none. She had looked, after 1936, through everything in the house. She had found old account books, old correspondence, the usual accumulation of a family that had been in the same place for 4 generations. She had found nothing that added to or contradicted what Pharaoh had written. The historian asked if she believed the letter was accurate. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I believe that Edmund Pharaoh was not the kind of man who made things up." The historian wrote it down. He included the quotation in his eventual book about land fraud in Virginia, published in 1956, in a footnote at the bottom of a page about Harlow. The footnote read, "For the complete account of the Pharaoh letter and its implications, see the Harlow Municipal Archive, Pharaoh Collection, Box 1. Harlow continued, "That is perhaps the least dramatic and most honest thing that can be said about what came after the letter was opened. Towns do not end when they are confronted with their true histories. They continue. They adjust. They deflect. They absorb the shock slowly over years and decades, and they become something slightly different than they were, though the difference is rarely as large as those who fought for the truth hoped, and rarely as small as those who preferred silence claimed it would be." By the 1940s, the immediate turbulence of the letter's opening had settled into something quieter, a kind of altered awareness, a particular quality of the town's relationship to its own past. People who had grown up in Harlow after 1936 grew up knowing about the letter in the vague half-assimilated way that communities know about uncomfortable truths, aware of it, capable of describing it in general terms, unlikely to spend time examining it closely unless they had a specific reason to. It was in the pamphlet at the library. It was in the annex for anyone who wanted to read it. It was a fact about Harlow the same way certain geographical features were facts about Harlow. Present, unchangeable, not requiring daily acknowledgement. The Guileham property, the land where Harold Carrell's ledger had said the matter of Margaret Voss was resolved, was developed in 1948 when a real estate company purchased it and laid out a small subdivision of modest homes. The woodland was cleared. Roads were cut through it. The houses went up quickly in the post-war building boom. And by 1950, families were living there who had no idea what the land had been called before it was subdivided and no reason to know. Dorothy Stokes, who was retired by then and living in a smaller house a mile from the annex, read about the development in the Courier. She did not write a letter to the editor. She did not contact the real estate company or the County Historical Society. She sat with the information for a few days and then she wrote a brief addition to her supplementary document, a note in the margin of the section about Margaret Voss, reading, "The Guileham property was developed in 1948. Whatever answer it may have held is no longer accessible. The question of Margaret Voss's fate must remain accordingly unanswered." She died in 1961 at the age of 70. Her collection of personal papers was donated to the annex by her daughter. Among those papers was a small notebook she had kept throughout her archival career, in which she had noted, in the compact and efficient handwriting of a woman who respected the preciousness of paper, the questions that her work had raised and been unable to answer. The last entry in the notebook, written sometime in the 1950s, read, "I have spent 30 years with Edmund Pharaoh's accounting of this town. I believe he was right about almost everything. I believe he was right to seal the letter when he did, and I believe he was right that the record should not remain false. I am less certain that any of it helped the people it was meant for, but I am not certain that certainty about that was ever on offer." The Pharaoh collection, the original letter, the cedar box, Dorothy Stokes's supplementary documents, the related records, remained in the Harlow Municipal Archive. It continued to be consulted occasionally by historians and genealogists and the rare curious resident. In 1978, a local teacher named Harold Brandt used the collection as the basis for a history unit he developed for the middle school. A careful, age-appropriate account of what the letter revealed and what it meant about how communities construct and sometimes distort their own histories. He taught the unit for 12 years until he retired. Several of his students over those years went on to study history at university, and at least 3 of them later mentioned in interviews or in writing that Brandt's unit had been one of the formative experiences of their education. The street named after Frederick Haynes, Haynes Lane, a short residential road in the older part of town, remained named Haynes Lane. It had not been renamed in the reorganization of 1941, and no subsequent proposal to rename it had gathered enough support to proceed. It was simply there, as it had always been, carrying the name of a family whose prominence was now attached to a record that no one in Harlow could entirely forget or entirely face. Edmund Farrow's house had been torn down in 1891, replaced by a commercial building that had itself been replaced in the 1930s by a hardware store. There was no marker at the site. His name appeared in the town's official historical materials, in the pamphlet, in the archive's finding aid, in the middle school history unit. But he had no monument, no dedicated day, no public recognition of the kind that the town habitually offered to its prominent figures. This was perhaps fitting. He had never wanted prominence. He had wanted the record to be accurate, in the small and incomplete and imperfect way that these things are accomplished in the real world. He had gotten what he wanted. The three people he had named, Samuel Oakes, Margaret Voss, and the man called James, had no such comfort. Their names were in the record now, where before they had been in nothing. Their stories were told, in the archive, and in the pamphlet, and in the history units, with as much honesty as the surviving evidence allowed. But they were still gone, and the circumstances of their going were still only implied. And the people who had made them go had lived out their lives in this town, in these houses, on this land, and had been respected and honored, and had their names attached to streets and buildings and church records. The fullest measure of what the letter accomplished was not a reversal of injustice. That was beyond its power. What it accomplished was a small, permanent, stubbornly durable correction to the official record of what Harlow had been. It placed the names Oakes and Voss and James in the archive alongside the names Haynes and Carell and Dunning and said, all of these people were here. All of them were real. This is, at minimum, what it means to keep an honest account. Edmund Farrow had understood that this would be the letter's only possible effect. He had written it anyway. In his small careful hand on a Thursday evening in October 1845, with the autumn dark coming on outside his window and Ruth Patten 4 weeks dead and the knowledge he carried too heavy and too specific to dissolve into forgetting, he had sealed it. He had handed it over. He had gone home, and the town had gone on, not knowing what it was carrying, not knowing that in a cedar box in the basement of the municipal hall, the true account of its founding sat waiting, patient as old wax, for the moment when there was finally no one left to protect. In March of 1936, in a small council chamber in Harlow, Virginia, a man named Walter Gibbs broke a seal that had been placed 91 years before by a man who had never expected his warning to be taken seriously and had prepared for that possibility with the only tool available to him: time. The town regretted it in the way that people regret hearing something they cannot unhear. Not because the truth was worse than they had imagined. Most of them had imagined nothing specific at all, but because specificity, when it comes to a thing like this, is its own kind of grief. To know that it was a man named Samuel Oakes who lost his 30 acres and then was not seen again. To know that a woman named Margaret Voss had been trusted with the wrong knowledge in the wrong household in the wrong year. To know that someone named James had tried to seek justice through the legitimate channels of his time and had been stopped before he ever got there. These names were in the record now. Small, permanent, exact, not monuments, not justice, just names where before there had been nothing. Edmund Farrow had spent his whole life keeping Harlow's accounts. In the end, the most important account he ever kept was the one he left behind for people he would never meet, in a town that would spend the next 90 years not quite able to look straight at what he had found. We do not know if the three people he tried to honor would have considered his letter enough. We do not have their words. We have only his, precise, measured, and addressed with the quiet tenacity of a man who understood that the truth does not expire, to whoever in this town's future was prepared to receive it. If that is you, then he succeeded. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was finally revealed? Leave your comment below. If this tale moved you, share it with someone who loves the hidden chapters of American history. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, and do not forget to tell us where in the world you are listening from.